We will conclude our discussion of the book of Numbers with an examination of some theological themes in the book. First theme is the danger of failing to live up to one's calling. God's people can fall into a spirit of rebellion, complaining, and ingratitude, and end up losing God's blessing. Indeed, Paul picks up on the book of Numbers in this regard, where he warns his church at Corinth. Now, these things happen as examples for us, referring to things in the book of Numbers, that we should not crave evil things as they also craved, a reference to their rejecting of God's provision of manna and craving for the things of Egypt in Numbers 11. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day, a reference back to the Baal Peor incident in Numbers 25. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did and were destroyed by the serpents, a reference to the fiery serpents who bit the Israelites in Numbers 21 and the bronze serpent incident that follows. Nor grumble as some of them did. That's all over the place in the book of Numbers, and were destroyed by the destroyer. These things happen as an example, and they were written for our instruction. Second theme that shows up is the promise to the patriarchs, one of the major themes of the Pentateuch, if not the central theme. You have the seed promise being fulfilled. They do a census, and they have very large numbers of people, 600,000 males counted. You have the land promise. Though the first generation failed to get to the land, Numbers ends with Israel on the brink of entrance into the land, camped just across from Jericho, where the conquest will start. There's blessings and curse. The promise to Abraham that those who bless you will be blessed and those who curse you will be cursed, back in Genesis 12, is actually repeated by Balaam. God puts that in his mouth. And indeed, this prophecy comes true. Balak, who hired Balaam to curse Israel, tried to curse Israel, and Moab, as a result, was doomed to being conquered by a Davidic king, the scepter and star of Numbers 24:17. And Balaam, who tried to curse Israel, also discovered the truth of his own oracle by ending up being cursed himself by being executed. A third theme that you can see in the book of Numbers has to do with the nature of God. We see something of God's presence, or to use a fancy theological term, his immanence. He was there in the midst of them in the camp. He was available to them in prayer as they come to the tent of meeting to worship him. And God in this book portrays his holiness. He has acts of judgment on Israel for their sins. But even leaders like Miriam and Aaron and Moses, all are subject of God's discipline. Miriam was struck with leprosy, and Aaron and Moses were told that they could not enter the land of promise because of their disobedience. Israel then is reminded that because God is holy, that they had to be careful to be holy themselves, to avoid both moral and ceremonial impurity. Another aspect of God's nature is his love. And God shows his love. The Hebrew word, a very important Hebrew word, is chesed. He shows his love in Numbers 14, where When Moses prays to God and appeals that God would spare Israel despite the fact that they had rebelled and failed to enter the land, he asks for him to act in accordance with his chesed, his love, his covenant love. Now, chesed is a hard word to translate, but its meaning seems to combine connotations of love and grace and faithfulness and loyalty to relationships. And God spared Israel based on his love and his grace and his faithful loyalty to the covenant relationship. God also shows himself to be a guider of his people. He did so visibly with Israel in those days, with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He showed himself to be a provider for his people, providing them with manna, with quail, with water, with victory over enemies. This book also teaches us something about worship. Worship is to be active. They were to bring gifts to God. They were to listen to him speak. They were to purify themselves before meeting with him. All things described in Numbers chapter 7 and 8. Worship included holy days and festivals when they would come before the Lord in special times of worship, and these are described in chapters 28 and 29. Worship includes special dedications to God, the Nazirite vow, and other vows in Numbers 6 and Numbers 30. This book says a lot about leadership, too. There are true and false leaders. True leaders are chosen by God, as was Aaron in Numbers 17, as is Joshua in Numbers 27. False leaders choose themselves, as seen in Korah in Numbers 16. There can also be false leaders, as in Balaam, who in some ways superficially appears to be a prophet, even though he is a wicked diviner. We can also see the inheritance of leaders. God's leaders are said to have God as their essential inheritance. The priests and the Levites did not inherit large portions of land, but we're told that they should be financially supported by Israel and their tithes. All this is described in Numbers 18. But they were encouraged because God was to be their special inheritance. So they didn't get land, but they had a special service for God that other Israelites did not have. And that's true of leaders today, too. We see, sadly, that leaders sometimes can be jealous of each other. So we have Aaron and Miriam, who were jealous of Moses in Numbers chapter 12. We have Korah, who was jealous of the Aaronic priesthood, even though he himself was a Levite and had a leadership role as in the ministry of the Levites. But nonetheless, he wanted more and was jealous of the Aaronic priest. We see how leaders make intercession for their people. Moses prays for Israel and saves them from destruction in Numbers 14. The Psalms even comment on this. He, referring to God, would have destroyed them had not Moses, his chosen one, confronted him in the breach to avert his destructive wrath. Psalm 106, verse 23. Other occasions, Moses intervened as God sent fire against the camp, and His intercession quenches the fire. He prays for Miriam after she contracts leprosy and God heals her. He prays concerning God's wrath after the Korah incident in Numbers 16. He prays what to do about the poisonous snake bites in the fiery serpent incident in Numbers 21. Even Aaron intercedes by doing propitiatory sacrifices that stem a plague and by offering incense in the Numbers 17 and offering atoning sacrifice in Numbers 15. We see something about the duties of leaders. Sometimes they delegate responsibilities, as Moses had others do the census. It was too much for one man to do. And in Numbers 11, there is a delegation of responsibility not only to Moses, but also to others who prophesied in God's name. Leaders guard that which is sacred and holy. That's what the Levites are commanded to do in Numbers chapters 3 through 5. Leaders are dedicated to God to bless others, as Aaron does the Aaronic blessing, "May the Lord bless you and keep you," in Numbers chapter 6. Leaders assist God's people in worship, as you see in Numbers 7 and 8. Leaders guide God's people in the action and spiritual warfare, as the Levites do in Numbers chapter 10. But then there can be the failure of leaders. Leaders can fail to live up to God's calling, as Moses and Aaron do in their disobedience in Numbers chapter 20. The book condemns various sins. There's sacrilege. There's jealousy, both in Numbers chapter 5. There's ingratitude in Numbers 11. There's gluttony in Numbers 11. There's envy in Numbers 12 and 16. There's racism against the Cushite woman by Aaron and Miriam in Numbers 12. There's Sabbath breaking in Numbers 15. There's rebellion against God in various places, including the Korah rebellion in Numbers 16 and the rebellion against God and Moses in the fiery serpent incident in Numbers 21. There's false teaching of Korah in Numbers 16. There's idolatry and sexual immorality in Numbers 25. And we too should take heed, since such sins still plague God's people today. But then there's renewal that this book encourages us to look for. There's a renewal of a new generation. The first generation that left Egypt failed, and they died in the wilderness, falling short. But hope and renewal came through the next generation, who actually come to enter the land. You get new leaders like Eleazar and Joshua, who rise up to replace the old leaders like Aaron and Moses. And every generation needs to raise up new leaders to replace those who are passing away. And it's Eleazar and Joshua that bring Israel into the land, something that the old leaders were unable to do. And then there's a new promise, that promise of a star and a scepter from Israel that will crush Moab, renews Israel's hope that it will enter the land, and it will have a king that begins with David, but ultimately goes to Jesus Christ. And God continues to renew his church today with new leaders and reminding us of his promises in Christ.